at least that. If you have read Rawdon Wilson's wonderful essay on space, then so much the better. That's extra reading. But I do hope that you'll all read John Thiem's The Textualization of the Reader. This essay by John Thiem in our anthology, The Textualization of the Reader, is really, I think, super brilliant, and it super explains a number of things. How many of you did read The Textualization of the mainly we got it right. Did any of you see my note once I was advised of my error? Oh, good. It pops up in a box, I think, on the Vista site. So in any case, my apologies to those of you who read Rawdon Wilson, although he's a wonderful essayist and I think an interesting essay as well. Okay, what else in the way of housekeeping? Before we go to textualizing readers and this whole wonderful confusion of reader, writer, and character, that is the world of the reader and the world inside the text, and this way in which the boundaries get mixed up and erased, and suddenly we don't know again where we stand, what is real and what is not, that ontological disruption that we've talked about of magical realism. Before we get there, I want to finish up with some slides, finish up Garcia Marquez, remember him from last week so long ago. I want to show you some pictures of wings and suggest to you, we saw Botero, we saw Fernando Botero, and I suggested that he's a kind of magical realist analog, visually speaking, to the text of 100 Years of Solitude. I didn't get a big rise from you on that. Comparison, I think it's an interesting one, but we didn't pursue it too much. What I want to pursue now is a very odd and different, or oddly different analog, visual analog to the verbal text of 100 Years of Solitude, and that is the New World Baroque. We saw things like Remedios the Beauty ascending to heaven with her sheets. Of course, we saw the old man with enormous wings, who makes a cameo appearance, as you noticed, in 100 Years of Solitude. So I wanted to show you some of the grandiosity of the Catholic Counter-Reformation Baroque art that all Latin Americans, well, let's say at least to the southern cone, certainly in Mexico, Central America, Colombia, Peru, the kind of Baroque representation of saints and devils and angels that would, I think, underpin some of Garcia Marquez's magical realism as well. You know, that world of invisible miracles that exists behind the concretions of reality and behind the painted surface is very familiar to Latin American Catholics and less to American Catholics who have been influenced by Protestantism, which, as you remember, during the Reform, the Protestant Reformation got rid of images. Why are those walls so bare in Massachusetts and those Puritan churches, or in, you know, a Methodist church in Des Moines, Iowa, where I grew up, or whatever? Why? Because it's policy. It's policy. The Protestant Reformation said to the Catholics, you've got too many pretty images, we're going to get rid of them. There's a lot of iconoclasm in the north of Europe in the 16th and early 17th centuries. What does the Church, the Catholic Church, say? That's wrong. The more you can feel, the more you can see, the more you can smell, the more you can enter physically and emotionally into the Mass, the more we're likely to have you as a believer forever. It was a real policy for proselytizing and for keeping believers when the Protestant challenge was going on in Europe. The Catholic Church lost 1/3 of its believers in Europe. Remember Martin Luther's 99 Thesis hammered on the door is 1517. So during the 16th century, there's this cataclysm, religious cataclysm. The Catholic Church does what they call, or what it's really a Protestant perspective, counter-reformation, whereby there's a reform internally in the Catholic Church as a response to the Protestant challenge, the Protestant rebellion, revolt, and much of what happens in the Counter-Reformation is beauty. The Church says, those Protestants are wrong. The Protestants say beautiful pictures are an obstacle to worship. What we say is they're an aid to worship. They're a conduit to the divine. You're not to worship the image, certainly not, but you can think about God better and Passion of Christ better. Why so many statues in Mexico and other places, Spain, of bleeding Christs on the cross. Why? If you can see it, you can imagine the suffering and appreciate it and profit from that sacrifice. So there's a real policy of beauty, I call it, a policy of the visual arts. If you've been to Rome or if you intend to go, you'll see fabulous Counter-Reformation or Baroque churches and so forth. I'm going to show you just a couple, but what I want to do here is the New World Baroque, what happens when the Catholic Reformation gets transplanted into, in this case, Mexico. It certainly got transplanted into Colombia, and I should have some Colombian illustrations, and I don't. But Phil, I think I'll start up back here, out here, and see how we do. I'm just going to show you a few of these, and then this may be something you'd want to pursue on your in your web project, which I'll talk to you a little bit more about. But now let's see. Okay, now Phil, if you can make us see the top of that image, that would be terrific, since that's where our title is. I know you did that before. These are four, let me start to talk about them. There we go, perfect, thank you. These are four images, and I can see I'm going to have to write less on them than I have. And the writing doesn't come out. No, there's something unadjusted about that, but you get a bit of an idea. Maybe it'll come into focus. This is a New World Baroque painter, Jose Ibarra. I've given you his dates, and what I did was take four of his paintings and put them on one page and then have a slide taken of that page. Look at all of those flying people. If we wonder where the scene of Remedios the Beauty rising to heaven with her her mother-in-law's sheets, we might say, well, this is rather typical of Catholic iconography of the time. I'm going to go back and take another look at that one. So on the upper left, your upper left-hand corner, we have the Ascension of Christ, of course. The right upper corner is Pentecost. It's Mary and the disciples, you remember, hearing from Christ 5 weeks after the resurrection, which is why it's called Pentecost. The Assumption of Mary into heaven and all of those cherubs, and of course you see the Trinity above her head, Christ, the Holy Spirit as a dove, the older man who's God. Very typical iconography. The people looking, you see down at the bottom the little deathbed scene, and now here comes Mary up. And then the final slide is the Virgin of the Apocalypse, or the Woman of the Apocalypse. She's not actually called the Virgin. In the book of Revelation, there's a woman clothed in the sun who takes the child, who could be either Christ or the church, and you see St. Michael down on her left, her right, our left, slaying a dragon. This is a scene from the book of Revelation, if any of you want to look into that. This is another Virgin of the Apocalypse by Miguel Cabrera, who is the greatest Mexican Baroque painter. This would be about 1750, rather late. The Baroque in Europe is considered to be the 17th century, 1600 to 1700. The Baroque continues in Latin America way beyond the time that the neoclassicism is being established in Europe. And so here we have the Virgin of the Apocalypse, and we have lots of iconography that we could talk about, but did you notice, I'm going to go back one, Ibarra was our first guy, not that you need to remember, but it's a slightly different rendition, I believe. Now hang on. Yeah, see how God is different. He's giving Mary wings. The woman is clothed in sun, and then she needs to flee the beast with 7 heads that St. Michael is doing battle with. And at some point, and you can see it if it's a better picture, they spew out water as if to flood the Virgin, so she needs wings to fly away. It's also wonderfully magical real. As Fernanda says, if they believe it in the Bible, I don't see why they shouldn't believe it from me. So there's a kind of, here the God figure is a little different, but you see how these poses get stylized, and so the Virgin of the Apocalypse with her wings, you see, no Virgin Mary is shown as wings, but she's called actually the Woman of the Apocalypse, but also known as the Virgin of the Apocalypse. So Jose Ibarra, here we have the greatest rendition of this thematic material, in my view, in Mexico, Miguel Cabrera. Now here's another one. Same thing, the Virgin of the Apocalypse, or the woman clothed in sun. And here, Villalpando, Cristobal Villalpando, who's another great Mexican Baroque painter, has made quite a lot of the water. You see all that water dripping down. St. Michael up there on our right-hand side with his sword. You will always know St. Michael Archangel. He has a sword, and because of this scene in the Bible. And here he's, wailing, flailing away at this rather confused and chaotic demon or dragon. That's what the word usually is, dragon with 7 heads. The 7 heads, there's one also a dragon with 10 heads representing the 10 emperors of Rome that persecuted the Christians and so forth. All of the apocalyptic iconography is very complicated. But just to show you one more, I don't think this is quite Remedios the Beauty either. I think maybe the previous one by Cabrera would be more like Remedios the Beauty, indeed beautiful. But it gives you an idea of the kind of iconography of saints and virgins that any Latin American writer, whether he's Catholic or not, and Garcia Marquez is not a avowed Catholic. What do I know about his beliefs? But he's never stated that he's a Catholic in any particular way. I'm still saying that this kind of iconography is in the air. If you open your eyes and you look, if you go to Mexico City, if you go to any part of Mexico, really, you'll see things maybe not this gloriously beautiful. These are the great masterworks of the Baroque period in the New World, the colonial or vice-regal period. Here is one of my most favorites, Luis Juarez. There was 3 generations of Juarezes. Luis is the grandfather, let's say, the first. Look, he's born in Spain, and he's sent by the emperor to Mexico to start painting the endless churches that were being built at the time. This is the mystical marriage of St. Catherine of Alexandria. And I want you to notice the angel wings. Now, I mean, really, you see there's a specific angel up there at the top assisting Mary, who is, by the way, not seated on a rock, but on a cloud. Virgins often are on clouds, and so she's up above in heaven. St. Catherine of Alexandria is down below. And look at the difference. There are 2 worlds here. There's the heavenly world and there's the earthly world. The earthly world has brighter colors. That brocade is absolutely divine. Look at the serving woman looking on with dismay and interest and awe. Well, the baby Jesus puts the ring on St. Catherine of Alexandria. Well, my point here is, if we needed a visual analog, I'm not saying an illustration, I'm not saying that it represents what we've read in Garcia Marquez, but what I'm saying is it's analogous, it's similar, it reminds me of. You can say, well, that's not good enough. We need to prove that Garcia Marquez has seen this painting or these paintings before we can make such a claim. I don't know whether he sees these paintings or not. They're in museums in Mexico City, and he's lived in Mexico City for 25 years. I would be surprised if you weren't aware of these paintings. I'm not saying, and of course, 1967, he wasn't living, when he wrote the book, wasn't living in Mexico City. So I'm making an argument for affiliation, for an analog rather than an illustration or an influence. See, we comparatists, my degree and my training is comparative literature, and we have to sit around and stand around and judge and justify our comparisons. So I've just been doing that for you, explaining, well, what I mean by showing one and suggesting a certain analogy. Chris, excuse me for making you wait so long.
Marquez, he did write 100 Years of Solitude in Mexico
City.
Oh,
in Mexico City, did he? Had he moved there by then already, or he was there for... Because then he went to Barcelona.
He went to Barcelona, and then he lost his job or something. Some contract ended. He's working, and then he came back to Mexico City. He's working for a paper there and writing short stories.
Okay, thank you very much. A friend of mine lately went to a wedding in Mexico City and got to sit next to him. He was so thrilled, and they chatted for half an hour. It was wonderful. So he's around Mexico City all the time, but has been sick. But he's better now. Somebody else, Zarla, did you? No. Okay. Well, we keep getting interrupted here. I just want you to notice that fabulous flutter of wings in the upper middle distance. Those are wings. That's light. That's eternity. That's infinity, but it's designed with those kind of heavy storm clouds on what he's doing is, of course, giving us a triangle. If this were an art history class, we would talk about the composition of the triangle, which ends exactly at the ring and the finger of St. Catherine. So, but I just love that bevy of wings. What's the right, that flutter of wings of Luis Juarez. Now another, also by Luis Juarez. This is kind of, it's early Baroque. It's early Baroque. He comes at the very beginning of the 1600s to Mexico from Spain. And here's another. He loves to represent Mary doing something wonderful to the saints. This is San Ildefonso getting the cassock. Now, it's not a ring from Jesus. It's a cassock being conferred upon this saint, and you always know San Ildefonso because he's always getting his cassock. That's how you know him. Just as you'll know St. Catherine, well, I'm going to go back. This is so easy. St. Catherine, you'll know by what? Anybody know St. Catherine's iconography or her attributes? What's that thing down in the bottom right-hand corner? I don't know how well you can see. Can you see this? I'm sorry, it's not coming through very clearly. Of course you can't see it, it's all blurry. But it's a Catherine wheel, what's called she was martyred on a wheel. And it's a piece of wheel with the spokes, so you know that's St. Catherine. You will also know that she's a martyr because she holds a palm. All martyred saints hold palms. So what, we say? Well, that's their attribute. There's something stereotypical about lives of saints, and especially about saints that are martyred. They're martyred in a certain way that gets reified, if you want, gets ossified, it gets petrified, it gets stuck as part of the representation of the figure. And here the cassock, the same for San Ildefonso. Oh, and well, one more back here. If I can go back. No. Again, the wings. Please notice, even behind Mary's head in an odd thing, it makes it look like there's a pointy thing coming out of her the right side of her head, but you see it's the continuation of the angel who is exactly above the hole in the cassock that's being conferred on Juarez. And another, this by the son, Jose Juarez, St. Augustine and Angel. Well, you're getting the idea by now. This is one of my favorites. Again, to Luis Juarez the first. I think of this somehow, and the old man with enormous wings. This is an old man with enormous wings, the devil, of course, being skewered by none other than, guess who? You all know now. It's St. Michael Archangel, Miguel Angel. Archangel, and we know it because he's the slayer of dragons. This one looks very human, and he he's not that beast with 7 or dragon with 7 or 10 heads, but we still recognize St. Michael. Okay, now I just want to, what am I arguing here? I'm arguing that if you know a little about Baroque and New World Baroque art, you might think about Garcia Marquez's magical realism in slightly different fashion. This is the archetypal Baroque, European Baroque work. You recognize it, the Transverberation of St. Teresa by Bernini. It's a statue carved out of stone. I got to see it this summer for the first time. It's unbelievable in either real life or on the screen. It's just amazing to me that any human hand could carve those amazing flowing robes in this way. This is Saint Teresa in Ecstasy. She writes in her life, she's a Baroque saint. She lived in the 1500s, was canonized in 1622, high Baroque period, 17th century in Europe. And she wrote in her diary, her life, that she went into a swoon and she felt the Word of God pierce her heart. And so here is an angel, one more angel. It's not Cupid, it's an angel piercing her heart with the Word of God. What everyone comments on in Baroque art of this sort is the alliance between eroticism and ecstasy, between spirituality and sensuality. And if you were to see her face close up, there's a kind, she's unified or she's unified or united with Christ, but her peer, St. John of the Cross, wrote what has to, mystical poetry that uses all sorts of erotic imagery to make the point about the union with Christ and the soul of the believer. So again, this might have some resonance for you as we think about Garcia Marquez. The physicality of the spiritual is absolutely unquestioned in Baroque imagery. This, back to Mexico, is a picture of the Virgin nursing Saint Caetano, as he's called. And what is she doing? That's her breast there. And she's giving him her milk. There are very few privileged saints who have had the experience, of being nursed by the Virgin. So this idea that the bodily functions are important for spiritual understanding is something that is very Counter-Reformation and very Baroque and very Catholic. It doesn't, in fact, resonate. Let me see, it's not my experience, and I don't know about yours, growing up as a Protestant in the U.S., to celebrate physicality. On the contrary, there's no Christ at all, of course, on the Protestant cross, much less a bloody body. So I tell you this, I mean, it's partly to aid you in thinking about the sensuality and sexuality of the figures in 100 Years of Solitude. This is Caravaggio, the great Caravaggio Baroque artist, and I show you a couple of his figures of saints, very different from the saints we've seen. This again, not again, we haven't seen Mary Magdalene yet. Her attributes are at her left hand, our left hand corner, at her right side. She's often shown the Magdalene at the foot of the cross. She, along with Mary the Mother and another Mary, were at the foot of the cross. She played a very important role. If you've read Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown, you'll know about her. This is the detail. These are her attributes: broken pearls and a vase of oil. Why? Because she dried Christ's hair with her, Christ's feet with her hair, and so this becomes, and she was a courtesan, she was a prostitute, so we're going to see her in the next image tearing off her pearls, that moment of conversion. This is a Spanish painter. Look again on the floor by her foot, those broken pearls, and she's in the very moment of conversion, giving up her old life of sin and of luxury and becoming Christ's follower. So you can see she's pushing away with her left hand that other world that she's occupied and so forth. So again, this kind of monomaniacal behavior of saints, and then the way it gets represented and represented and represented according to the attributes that are assigned over time, over centuries. Saints' lives are a super interesting thing, and if anybody wants to do anything like the representation of a particular saint and relate it to some of what we're reading, that would be interesting. This is a New World Mexican example, again, of the Magdalena. She, after Christ's death, she goes into penance in the wilderness, and she's often shown as a penitent, as a kind of supreme penitent. I'm going to just say one more thing. Notice that she's holding a cross, and it's a crucifix. The little white part on the cross just in front of her face is the body of Christ. She's doing what it was thought one should do in Counter-Reformation Catholic meditative practice. You look at an image and you focus on Christ's suffering. So that's what she's doing. The Magdalene is painted 1,000,000 times looking at a crucifix in the wilderness, contemplating Christ's sacrifice for her. And then one more, St. Francis Xavier. You can see the kind of hyperbole, at least to our modern American eyes, or mine anyway. He was a great preacher. He was the assistant of St. Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, and he's portrayed that way because he was a great preacher and because the Word of God seared his heart again. So that kind of literalizing of feeling might, again, tell us something about Garcia Marquez. Now, I end with this. I believe this is our last one. This is Las Meninas. We're now going to change to another kind of Baroque, a much more intellectually game-playing Baroque. This is mentioned, as you remember, by Borges in the essay for today, When Fiction Lives in Fiction. And what is, you know this painting, and I'm sorry about the poor quality of the slide. It's much more beautiful than this. Have you seen this, or you know this painting? It's one that everyone should know. It's the most, I'm going to go back. It's the most famous of the Spanish Baroque paintings. Velázquez, Diego Velázquez was the court painter for Philip IV. We haven't gone into Spanish history very much here, and we probably won't. What is he painting? It's a trick. There's nobody in the scene that he's painting. It's the royal couple who are reflected in the mirror at the back of the room. They indeed look like the patrons of Velázquez, Philip IV and his queen. And it's called Las Meninas because, which means ladies in waiting, but not all of these figures are ladies in waiting. The central figure is the princess, the Infanta Margarita. And so we see Velázquez himself, the painter, painting himself painting there on the left. We see the canvas, the back of it, that he's painting. We know what the subject is because we see the subjects reflected in the mirror at the back. That's what that gamesmanship. Remember at the first paragraph of When Fiction Lives in Fiction, Borges says, remember I saw this painting in the early 20s, or he says late 20s, in the Prado, where it hangs till this day, of course, as much of Velázquez's work does, the great museum in Madrid. And he says they'd placed a mirror in front of the painting to continue the reflection of images. So, without going on too much more about this painting, let me just say that I would expect you to be familiar with it, this one, and the Bernini, St. Teresa. I mean, just as part of your cultural education. Of course, many of you will have taken art history courses and know quite a lot about the Baroque. It's my current passion, in fact, the Baroque, and I do think that magical realism is very closely tied. In fact, what I like to say, it's the latest flowering of the Baroque in the New World, magical realism, because there is so much in common with the Baroque in terms of the sensuality, in terms of the religious iconography, or the religious sensibility. By religious, I mean here not necessarily Catholic, but that sense of the invisible behind the visible, or inhering in the visible. So anyway, I just wanted to show you some of those for the fun of it, and I like looking at pictures and thinking about the written word in the same thought, so maybe you all will too. Now, what I want to do is look at John Thiem, and my apologies to those few of you who didn't read John Thiem, but I think it's quite a brilliant essay, and so I want to go through it with some care. Could someone just give us a summary, or at least get us started? First of all, we will find the right page. Hang on. Thiem, here he is. It's 235. Who haven't I heard from that I'd love to hear from? Jason? Nope. Zarla, we sort of heard from you. Did you get to this essay?
No.
Oh, what is this? Who got to it? William, did you? Oh, goody. Thank you. Just give us a little summary. I think this is a brilliant essay. It's short, and it explains Borges. So if you want Borges explained, please read it. And we'll certainly cover him on the quiz next week, as we will all of Borges, by the way. William, tell us.
It seems like this was about about the textualization of, I guess how it says, like how it's more about not necessarily the real reader, but more or less the fictional reader within the text. Mm-hmm. That's what I seem to make of it. And there seems to be several stories that, like the Julio Cortázar, and like the never-ending story, that sort of thing, where the reader of the story actually becomes a character.
Right. Yeah. It's the confusion of the boundary that we count on in realism between the fictional world and our world. And he's saying this is a particular kind of magical realism, but it's a kind that's fairly common, where the boundary is blurred between the reality of the printed page and the reality of the reader sitting in the armchair, who in Cortázar's story, as you point out, becomes the victim of the murder story he's reading. Now, this is very useful for our purposes because we saw an example of it only last week at the last 3 pages of 100 Years of Solitude, where the boundary between the reader in the text and what he's reading is blurred and collapses. Who is that? It's Aureliano Babilonia. We think he's a character in this text, we're reading along, and then suddenly he's reading his own life within the text. So he becomes both reader and author in a sense, and it's part of, I think, why we discussed this at length last time, why Melquiades is put in there at the end. It's a way of splintering that realistic separation, that transparent window that realism is based on. Now, let's be clear, we're going to talk about trompe-l'œil. It's a kind of trompe-l'œil. That is a nice French phrase, T-R-O-M-P-E-L'-O-E-I-L. It means deceive the eye. We already talked about that earlier. That's Borges' stock in trade. His magic is a textual magic. It's not the same kind at all. In fact, I think of Borges as something like the opposite of Garcia Marquez, which is why I start with the 2 of them. We have one, the Great Family Saga. We have another where, in 3 pages we have a little abstract thought about the universe as a whole, or literature as a whole, or how readers read. It's much more a fiction of ideas, and indeed he didn't call his short stories, he called them ficciones. Fictions, which in Spanish is cuento, would be a short story, so he's making a distinction. I call them metaphysical musings, and so John Theme's going to help us understand the basis of Borges' magic in this strategy of confusing what's read and who reads it. So, once more, I'm going to say it once more. Realism, Moby Dick, The Great Gatsby, Huck, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, depend upon a transparent window. The reader sits on one side of that window. We watch, we read what's going on the other. Those characters don't come through that window and sit in my chair or address me, although there can be narrators in realistic fiction that address the reader directly. But usually, like realistic theater, it's called the fourth wall. The fourth wall's missing. You're in the room watching it, except that you're not in the room, you're seated in a chair. John Theme mentions Tom Stoppard's The Real Inspector Hound, where there's a playing across, and suddenly the audience are actors, and you realize that some of the people in the play are watching a play. It's a great play if you ever have a chance to see it. So, okay, that transparent window is broken. We're going to see slides of it too. This happens in painting, and next week I'm going to show you some trompe-l'œil paintings, which I hope will also clarify this concept. But what then, William, can I keep on depending on you here for a little bit? So what? Okay, so we have this breaching of the most required element of realism, which is that separation of worlds. It's breached in different ways. How does he talk about that? Do you want to point to any of these, any of his notions here? This is what he calls he's talking, as you quite well point out, less about the real reader, though we start to wonder ourselves, and at the end of Borges, I know why this is upsetting, because we could be fictional. If they can be real, we can be fictional. But he calls it the textualization fable. The story of a reader whose boundary collapses between his world, the fictional world of the reader in the fiction, and the book he's reading. Right? But is there any in particular place you want to go, or shall we just point out some passages? I mean, I think that understanding this is already understanding the essay. Any place you want to go to in particular, or others of you, whether you had questions or comments? Because I can march us through this text as well as the next, but if you all want to start someplace, yeah, Chris?
I really like
No, push your button, Chris, thank you.
We're on page 241.
241, okay, let's
Because
go
I've
there.
been
Wait a
looking throughout this, through discussing the art, the difference between the art aspect of magical realism
Yeah.
and the textualization.
Yeah.
And then this really did it to me. With the quote on the bottom of the first paragraph. Reading removes the subject-object division that constitutes all perception.
Okay, now stop. Where are you in exactly? This is
Page
241.
The paragraph on top.
Oh, yeah,
and
right.
The bottom of that paragraph, right before the last sentence.
Okay.
It's a quote.
Their essential point is, goodness.
Yet theories such as these do raise interesting questions by the extreme limits.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the first full paragraph, so just above the middle of the page. Are you finding that? He's quoting a critic who's talking about this. Let's just read that sentence one more time. At one point, is everybody there? I couldn't find it for a minute. At one point, Iser himself seems to approach the borders of magical realism when he asserts without qualification that, quote, reading removes the subject-object division that constitutes all perception. Fables of textualization explore the most extreme answers to such questions. Okay, the subject-object division, what does he mean by that, Chris, or how do you take that phrase?
You can say it like a subjectivity or an objectivity,
Yeah.
where we can look at a text and become the subject, whereas it might be just an object whenever we see it externally within our lives.
Yeah.
Or whenever we see a painting, you cannot paint a ball red and call it blue.
Yeah.
It's going to remain red.
Yeah.
You know?
I thought you were referring to the objectivity of Roe. Remember how he celebrates those objects, and he doesn't quite say what you're approaching, I think, which is to say that the subject and the object collapse because the object itself has a certain kind of subjectivity or animism that
everything can be redefined within the text.
Yeah, okay.
Even the reader or even the antagonist, protagonist, the reader becomes the antagonist, all that becomes redefined because you can't look at it and say this is this or this is that. It allows confusion.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I like that phrase too. What I began to do when I was preparing to discuss this essay with you is to begin to do binaries. You know, it's said about Western thought that we need binarisms, that we have, you know, evil and good, or salt and pepper. I don't know. This plays with the notion of binaries, this whole essay. And we could start by doing text. I'm going to try to write so you can read it. Text, world. Or we could do character, reader. We could do... Actually, Borges, in his essay that we're going to look at, speaks of the ideal. He says every novel is an ideal plane inserted into the real. So we could do ideal and real. Now it's quit working. Yeah, you don't get more binary than that. Or fiction and life. All of the things that we depend upon when we read realistic novels are now subverted. I also did then when I got to object, subject. And I kept on going, textual and extra-textual and so forth. So these textualization fables, this kind of story, or those last 3 pages of 100 Years of Solitude, take that little slash between each of those pairs and erase it, which I can even do with this. Doing, 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 doing. Nope. There, you see. That's the magical realism of this sort. It's a particular sort, but as John Thiem says, an important sort for understanding the ontological disruptions of the boundaries. So let me, or the state, there's lots of phrases that are worth underlining, and maybe you will have underlined some, but let's just go through and nail this down. I think we have it already, but look on, if you will, on page... he tells us at the bottom of 236 that he's going to focus on textualization of fictional readers, what he calls textualization fables. That's at the bottom paragraph there, the third line. Then at the top of 237, there's the nice quotable quote. Start number 1, at the very top of 237. The seeming impossibility of a textualization occurring in the world of the real reader signals the magical realist nature of this topos. By topos, he means this structure, this topic. Then the sentence that I like very much: to enter the world of a text literally, and not just literarily, is on the same order of impossibility as entering the world inside a mirror or a painting. At best, you might break the mirror or poke a hole through the canvas with your finger, but with a text, the very means of literal entry seems especially elusive. How do you get in? The mind has, well, if you've read the Kugelmass affair, you know that Woody Allen has a hysterical way of getting into Madame Bovary, or his character. How do you get in? The mind has little other recourse than the proverbial black box, and indeed Kugelmass enters Madame Bovary through some such thing, a plywood cabinet in the office of the magician Persky. Okay, so this impermeability of the literary text, it doesn't mean we can't enter it mentally or literarily, as he says, but how do we enter literally? What's the objective status? He says, well, it's going to be magic. Now, look at the next page, 238, his discussion of a book that discusses this matter called Lost in a Book. Victor Nell's Lost in a book I have not myself read. I like the sentence very much where he talks about the boundary, the dissolution, I'm not sure quite where it is, the dissolution of the boundary between the self and the world of the text, the state of being in two texts at once. And then he gets to this notion of a reader trance. That's 2 lines up from the bottom of 238. But let's start that paragraph. Nell sees reader trance as a result of pleasure reading, which he calls ludic reading. Now he's going to talk about light reading. He's going to say, anyways, let's follow it. Let us say then that the trance of the ludic reader, ludic, as you know, means game or playful. But here he's using it as the light reader, the reader for pleasure, right? Is the subjective mode or condition of textualization. You're kind of in a trance, right? And you're going to be textualized, brought in. The ludic reader longs to escape from the extra-textual world into the text. Hence the pejorative expression escapist reading, or the ludic reader would like to have the world of the text cast its aura over the actual world, enlivening and enriching it. Textualizations in recent fiction do draw, in fact, on the kinds of texts that are most often the object of ludic reading. Cortázar's protagonist reads a conventional crime novel, ends a fantasy novel, and the Pink Panther in Kenneth Graham's textualization fable for children reads a ghost story. I haven't read that one. Kugelmass, though a professor of humanities, meets Madame Bovary as a cross between soft porn and soap opera. She treats Madame Bovary as a cross between soft porn and soap opera. Ludic reading in particular seems to open readers to the pleasures and perils of textualization. And then he continues on that point. The nature of reading itself is at stake. How do we read? How do we conceptualize the world, the people, the settings of the text we're reading? What is our readerly relation? If we're reading realism, it's invisibility. If we're reading this kind of textualization fable, we'd better turn around and make sure there's not a murderer behind us, as John Thiem will point out. He talks a bit more. Let me just see about a couple more pages. Go to 240, a couple more paragraphs and passages that I think will have us totally on top of this brilliant little essay. Textualizations make us aware of the act of reading, he says. That's the top first full paragraph, 6 lines down on 240. And then he starts going on about the ontological basis. Now, that's the word we've been using here to define magical realism. And I've said we have to ask this question. It's an ontological question. What's real? What is the nature of reality? If we aren't asked to answer that question, what's the nature of our reality? What's the nature of the text reality? And if magical realism has its way, at the end our definitions, our answers will be amplified. We'll say, people really do go to heaven with their sheets, or the blood does find its way home and not just metaphorically, or maybe I'm reading the story of my own life and I'll have to skip 11 pages to keep up, as does Aureliano Babilonia. So look at this paragraph, and then we'll, I think, be able to go on. Well, there's a couple more. Let's just read this top paragraph that starts 240, top of 240 together. Textualization fables, and I would say magical realism, tend to make readers more conscious of the act of reading itself. Thus, a textualization is a magical realist topos. Again, that word. It's a strategy. It's a technique. It's a theme. All of those things. Textualization is a magical realist topos which includes a pronounced metafictional dimension. As such, textualizations explicitly raise in the reader's mind the following questions. What is the ontological basis, if any, of a fictional world? What is the fictional basis of the extra-textual world? What is the reader's role in constituting both worlds? I think those three questions are super important for our entire course. But he is saying that this kind of fiction, which is about fictional readers, is a particular way of asking that question, or it's a particularly trenchant way of asking that question, because I've already said, well, 100 Years of Solitude asked that even before you get to the last 3 pages. How are we to take this blood, or how are we to take the fact that no one remembers how many people were killed in the plaza in Macondo, and so forth. So this business of this kind of reading, and I think we'll see it again and again in Borges, is a kind of magical realism. It asks the ontological questions that magical realism asks. Turn to 244. There's one more place, and then there's a footnote I want to call your attention to as well. I love this nice little conclusion. It seems to me to be, I just love economy. It's so compressed and does so much. It's not my forte, and so I admire it when I see it. I tend to I overwrite, and dear John Thiem writes just the right amount, I think. Look at just section 3 then, and we'll read a couple of sentences here. The magic in magical realism emerges from the interpenetration of irreconcilable worlds. Textualization is arguably the paradigmatic topos of magical realism. It means it's the epitome of this irreconcilable worlds merging, because it's worlds that in realism don't, the reader's world and the world of the text. So he's saying textualization is the epitome, the paradigmatic topos of magical realism, because of the way in which it showcases this mystifying phenomenon. Text may encompass worlds, and worlds may be text, but the way they come together, clash, and fuse in a textualization violates our usual sense of what is possible. So, I'm going to stop there and just ask you to look over at the opposite page at footnote 5. John Thiem agrees with me that visual analogs or affiliations are sometimes useful when reading literature. Look at what he says in footnote 5. Besides Don Quixote, the most important antecedent of textualization is to be found in the illusions of Baroque art, in trompe-l'oeil art, which I'm going to be showing you, where an aggressive pictorial naturalism endeavors to obliterate the barriers separating spectator space and pictorial space. Just saw it in Las Meninas. That play on the mirror reflection puts me in the place where the king is standing, the spectator, and I'm asked to think about the relation of my space, that exterior space, to the interior space of the painting. So it says, endeavors to obliterate the barrier separating spectator space and pictorial space, that is, the world outside the painting and that within it. Just as a textualization eliminates the reader by absorbing him or her into the text, so Baroque illusionism works to do away with the spectator, who is compelled to become a part, if not an actor, in the world inside the painting. The trompe-l'oeil doors, the thumbs of subjects hooked around the frames of paintings. I'll show you pictures. The protrusion of objects from pictorial world into ours, the painted subjects who consciously observe the spectator, all contribute to the destruction of aesthetic distance and engender a mystique of participation. And then he has another interesting paragraph, too. So that pictorial illusionism, which I find utterly fascinating and fun, and you have to be a fabulous painter to pull it off, as I think you have to be a fabulous writer to pull this kind of thing off, might interest some of you for your web projects. By the way, do be thinking about your web papers, as I'm calling them, because that's coming up in about 3 weeks. And I'll give you lots of ideas, too. But just think about what you'd like to pursue. And you might want to look ahead on the syllabus, because we won't have read a number of our important works and think you might be interested in that, too. So do keep that firmly in mind. Now the fun begins. Let's see, what order did I have these on the syllabus? We can do them in that order. It worries me that some of you haven't read John Thiem yet, though, so please do. Which you want to start with, the Kugelmass episode, Continuity of Parts, Kugelmass? Yeah, did everybody get to Kugelmass? Now, I take it you were all able to read this on the web and so forth. Our Vista site is working, I trust. It's okay?
It was
slow being loaded onto your computer? Oh, downloading it. Yeah, I'm about ready to put some of these pictures on our website, and I hope that doesn't make hours of downloading. And I don't mean for you to download them particularly, but I'm hoping that that won't be too much for your computers. Yeah, Tracy, did you have something?
I just answered my own question.
Yeah, it's from, you'll see, it's from a collection of stories by Woody Allen called Side Effects. Yeah,
I do have a question.
Tracy,
I was wondering what this actually came from, because the Margaret Atwood at the
I'm sorry, I should have had that scanned out. It came from the Norton Anthology, and in fact it's precisely the text that John Thiem cites in a footnote when he cites the Kugelmass affair. I mean, I had never heard of the Kugelmass episode, rather, until I read John Thiem, and then I ran to the Norton Anthology that he cited, but I have actually since then gotten a copy of Side Effects, so I need to take it out of the original source, besides which I find the footnotes annoying. I don't know how you like those, but Tracy, tell us about this. Give us a quick plot summary and just give us the textualization fable stuff, will you?
Sure. Kugelmass is a professor of humanities, and he's dissatisfied in his relationship with his wife, his second wife in particular, and so he leaves his analyst after realizing that he wants to live out his fantasies and not just talk about them, to deal with them. So he goes to a magician, calls him up, and gives him an opportunity to get involved in any novel, in any relationship in a novel that he would like to. So he gives him the offer of Ophelia, Hester Prynne, Temple Drake, and he decides that he wants to meet Emma Bovary. Pretty much in the middle of her novel.
And he's very carefully calculated, if you know the novel, between Léon and Rodolphe. She has two big affairs. In the first, both men leave her, of course. But it's perfect that he wants to be no later than page 20, because that's where that Rodolphe comes in, you know.
Exactly. And then, so he gets into this little the proverbial black box that he writes about. And he gets in the box, and he brings the novel, and the knocking on the box, and then he's transplanted into a relationship with Emma Bovary, and he kind of corrupts her slowly and lets her know what's going on in his life. And there are no questions asked about how he's there. He just appears on the bed, and she gives him a glass of wine. And then, he, in the middle of this great afternoon, when they're telling each other very deep things with their eyes, he realizes that the time has come for him to meet his wife Daphne at Bloomingdale. So he jumps back out. And, he goes back to meet her every few times, and each time, finally he decides that he wants to bring her to New York so she can meet. And of course she comes, and they have this great time, but then she has no way back. The box breaks, and she suddenly can't get back into the novel. Of course, at the same time, as students are studying this novel in their course, they're realizing that they're like, well, who is this Jewish guy that's come up in the middle of in the middle of this relationship? The professor who's teaching it kind of shrugs it off. Oh, the thing about good literature is that you can read it many times and find something.
That is hysterically funny.
Yeah, and then